Few words to say later on, but first, I'm very glad that Dr. Brian Hanley from the School of History and Archives in UCD is coming along to say a few words first.
Thanks, Kieran. I'm very pleased to be able to help launch Kieran's book here tonight. I think it's a very significant and very important book in terms of the history of the Irish Revolution. It's also a very personal story about Kieran's grandfather, Tom Glennon, and I'll leave it to Kieran or maybe other members of the family to talk about the personal aspects. One thing which I would mention is that this story concerns Tom Glennon when he played a central role in the Belfast IRA and then was later an officer in the Free State Army. And he was between 20 and 23 years of age when he played that role. And sometimes, especially for those of us who are well past 23, it's easy to forget that how young many of the people who played a pivotal role in the events in those era were. I think this book is important because it is about the Belfast IRA. And unlike the IRA in other parts of Ireland during the War of Independence, the Revolution, or the Tan War, whatever you want to call it, there is actually very little written about the Belfast IRA. There's no equivalent of Guerrilla Days in Ireland or My Fight for Irish Freedom written about what happened in Belfast. There's very little written about what occurred in Belfast in comparison to, for example, the stories of the flying columns in Tipperary and Limerick and Cork or elsewhere. And I think, again, this book is significant because it does begin to tell that story and to fill in aspects of what's often been ignored or forgotten. Because Belfast was different in those years. Firstly, of course, because from 1920 onwards, there was an attempt to form two states on this island. Partition was put in place. And as a result, the Belfast IRA in many ways obviously lost. But even many Republicans tend to remember the War of Independence as very much a 26 counties affair and forget that actually things were happening in Tyrone and Armagh and Antrim and in, of course, Belfast in those years as well. So the story told in this book is significant for that reason. It's also important, however, because what happened in Belfast is in many ways very confusing for those of us who have maybe a traditional idea about the War of Independence. In December 1918, when Sinn Féin swept Ireland in terms of winning seats at Westminster, in West Belfast, Eamon de Valera of Sinn Féin was defeated by a Home Ruler, Joe Devlin. And during that election, Sinn Féin canvassers were beaten up on the Falls Road by supporters of Devlin. Devlin had huge support among the Catholic working class of West Belfast. So ironically, in many ways, when you consider what people often think is the centre of Irish republicanism today, in 1918, West Belfast was one of the few places that elected a Home Ruler, not a Sinn Féiner. And this meant, of course, that Republicans in West Belfast faced particular challenges. They were a minority, first of all, within the nationalist community. They faced, on the one hand, a very large organisation called the Ancient Order of Hibernians, which are often forgotten about today, but which would often physically resisted Republicans. They also had to deal with very large numbers of Catholic ex-servicemen, men who'd fought in the First World War. Now, some of those men became Republicans, but some of them didn't, and they remained a factor in the politics of West Belfast during those years as well. So the IRA were a minority, and of course they were a minority of a minority, because Catholics only made up a quarter of Belfast's population. And one thing we do know about the years, particularly from 1920 to 1922, is that there's intense sectarian conflict in Belfast, in which Catholics are disproportionately the victims and in which they are often surrounded and pogromised by loyalists and by unionists. And this book, of course, talks about that. But it also points out that this aspect of the trouble caused a lot of problems for the IRA. We again, in modern terms, tend to think that the IRA had a traditional role in Belfast of defending Catholics. Actually, when the trouble began in 1920, the IRA in Belfast were under orders to ignore what they called fratricidal strife. Their main object was to do what the IRA and the rest of the country were doing, attack the Crown forces. They were not to take part in fighting between Catholics and Protestants. Now that obviously changed, but it again does point up to particular problems that existed for those who wanted to maintain a pure Republican perspective of the fight against Britain and those who joined the IRA in order to defend their local communities. And throughout the book you'll also find that there's often tension between those who'd been in the IRA from 1916 or 1917 or 1918 and those who joined after 1920, the so-called Pogrom. recruits. So again, this book deals with that aspect, which really wasn't present in most of the rest of Ireland, obviously. Also worth pointing out, of course, that the role the IRA played in Belfast was controversial within the IRA itself. In the 1970s, Peadar O'Donnell, who features in this story in What Happens in Donegal, said, "We never had an IRA in Belfast. What we had was a battalion of armed Catholics." Now, O'Donnell said that in the 1970s. He didn't say it in the 20s and 30s. And I think it has more to do with his views about the provisional IRA than it does about the actual situation in the 20s and 30s. And as Kieran shows in the book, there are discussions within the IRA in Belfast about exactly what their role should be in the conflict that's taking place there. And that's a very important point in the book. Somewhat grimmer, but also very significant, is that Kieran has managed to chart, for the first time, the full impact of the violence over those years from 1920 to 1922. There's been attempts by various historians, from Father Hassan and Peter Hart, Robert Lynch and Jim McDermott and others, to try and put a number on the amount of deaths in Belfast in those years. Kieran comprehensively looks at this, area by area, organisation by organisation, and comes up with a figure of 498, which shows in many ways how intense and savage the violence was. In many ways actually more intense in a lot of years than in a lot of years of the modern conflict. And again, that's quite a significant part of the book, I think. And of course, it makes for very grim reading, but also very interesting reading, because he looks at the role of the IRA, the role of loyalist organisations, the role of the Crown Forces, particularly the Beast Specials, the role of Catholic ex-servicemen, and the role of the British Army in various aspects of the violence in Belfast in those years. Finally and importantly, he also deals with something that's probably even more confusing to modern minds about the violence in Belfast. And that is, why did the majority of the leadership of the Belfast IRA, many of their most active fighters, many of the men who'd been at the sharp end of the conflict in the city from 1918 onwards, support the treaty? Because in 1922, men like Tom Glennon supported the treaty. Many of them came south and, like Tom Glennon, joined the Free State Army. Now again, to modern ears, this might seem absolutely amazing, because after all, don't we all know that wasn't the Civil War down here fought over the issue of partition? But again, as Kieran shows, it's a lot more complicated than that. And for the Belfast IRA, it was a lot more complicated as well. And again, he shows that even in 1922, there were many people with what might be called partitionist attitudes about the six counties and about Republicans north of the border. One figure looms large over any study of the IRA in those years, and that's Michael Collins. Now, Michael Collins is by any standard the most iconic figure today in modern Ireland. A survey was done a couple of years ago of TDs in the New Dáil after the recent general election. And across parties, Collins stood out as the most popular figure. From teaching history in various universities, I can tell you that Collins is still the single most popular figure among students. On numerous occasions, I've handed back essays with a question, where did you come across this information about Collins or De Valera, only to be met with the answer, well, I think it was in that film. And actually the Michael Collins movie is probably the single most important influence on people's thinking about the IRA in those years. Of course, that film barely mentions the North at all. But what's interesting about Michael Collins is, despite the treaty, despite the fact that he's Chief of Staff of the new Free State Army, his stock remains very high, not just among people in Southern Ireland, but among Northern nationalists as well. A few years ago, the police in Northern Ireland raided Sinn Féin's offices in Stormont. Eagle-eyed people among you may have spotted that on the walls of those offices there was a poster for the Michael Collins movement. Again, this seems somewhat ironic. Isn't Michael Collins, after all, one of the men responsible for the Anglo-Irish Treaty? But Collins has always retained a very strong standing among Northern Republicans who believe he had something up his sleeve, who believe there really was a theory behind the stepping stone, and who point to things like in 1922, the secret arming of the Northern IRA by Michael Collins and others within the Free State government, and believe that really, had he lived, he had some plan to unravel partition. Now, controversially, I think, but also significantly, Kieran argues that Michael Collins did have something up his sleeve, but that was really something akin to a betrayal, an attempt to neutralise the Northern IRA and he looks in detail at the events around the Northern IRA's offensive in May 1922 and argues something very different about Michael Collins than you will find in some of the more enthusiastic stories about him. So I think that, again, is very, very significant. Kieran has been able to do this because over the last 20 years or so we've been blessed with the opening of more and more archives, and the fact that we're able to look more and more in depth at what happened in those years through the accounts of the people who served themselves and through the opening up of various government papers. So this, I think, is a significant work of history, as well as a very important story about one man's role in the fight for independence, and I'm very pleased to help launch it, and I hope you all buy a copy. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Brian. I'll try not to keep everyone too much longer, but I'd like you to indulge me for about 10 minutes or so. I'd like to start by expressing my gratitude to a number of people, and first and foremost those, my partner Ruth, who for the 2 years that this book was being researched, written, edited, she not alone put up with me taking myself off up to the spare room for hours at a time, but she encouraged the work, she gave me patience, she brought me coffee, she brought me cake, and I just wouldn't have got this far without her, so thanks a million, hon, for all your support. Going a lot further back in time, I'd also like to thank my mum. When I was a very small boy in London, all the activity in the house would have to stop, where we sat down to hear stories read out on Listen with Mother on the BBC radio. And my mum promised me that whenever I went to school I would learn to read for myself. So the first day of school I was delighted to go in through the gates, but I came out in tears because I still couldn't read yet. Well, in the end, Listen with Mother eventually turned into Written by Son, but it was my mum who gave me the first introduction to the world of books. Once I could actually learn to read, I was very lucky to grow up in a house that I think my dad was intent on turning it into a library, because it was coming down with books, pamphlets, magazines, official government reports, newspapers, clippings from newspapers. My dad didn't just believe that the pen was mightier than the sword. He felt that words were a weapon, and I think he wanted to have the biggest stockpile in the whole world. But it did mean that for a young boy with an interest in history, there was an abundance of reading material for me to dive into. Another great formative influence I want to acknowledge is a writer by the name of Tom Henry. I only got to know his work years after we had moved to Dublin, but he's somebody I admire very greatly. He lives in Dublin now, but in 1970, while still living in Belfast, he was commissioned to write a pamphlet about the Battle of St Matthew's, which marked the first time the IRA had appeared in Belfast with guns since the North had erupted the previous year. His conclusions didn't suit the powers that be, but rather than change what he had written, he stood over what he had said, and he ended up telling the bishop on whose behalf the pamphlet had been commissioned. He said to him, "The Italians have the mafia, the Unionists have the Orange Order, but you have no need of either, for you've already surrounded yourself with corruption." And with that, he left the Bishop of Down and Connor standing gobsmacked in his own palace. And not surprisingly, the pamphlet never saw the light of day, but I really hope that some of that integrity and sense of confidence in one's own argument is reflected in my book. I'm very proud that he's here tonight. I'd especially like to thank Mary Fian from Mercier Press for believing in the potential of the book whenever I sent her the manuscript, and also Mary's team at Mercier, Wendy Logue, who oversaw the whole editing and production process, Sarah Duffy, who designed the cover, and Patrick Dunphy, who's looked after the publicity. Over the last while, a lot of people have asked me, what's the book about? Rather than answer the question directly, I'd like to mention a number of people who helped me along the way while putting the book together. And one of the things I found incredible is, over the last 2 years, although what happened in Belfast in the 1920s has largely been forgotten about, how many people I still managed to come across whose relatives were involved in those events. So hopefully by telling how these people helped me, it'll illustrate a little bit about what the book is about. So in the same way that a DVD has a set of bonus extras features, what follows is a bit like the making of the book. The first person I'd like to acknowledge is Rory Fitzpatrick. We're planning on having a launch similar to this in Belfast in a couple of weeks' time. I'm looking forward to meeting him in person then. Rory gave me permission to use a photograph of his father and another Belfast IRA officer in the 1920s called Roger McCorley. Now, Rory's father was Tom Fitzpatrick, and he took over as commanding officer of the Antrim Brigade of the IRA after my grandad was captured by the British in April 1921. Now, the very fact that my grandad was a brigade commander came as complete news to my dad. Now, I think he took it brilliantly. He said to me, "Well, now that we know I'm descended from the officer class, maybe the rest of you start treating me with the respect I deserve." The next person I'd like to mention is Lieutenant Colonel Frank Lawless. Frank's grandfather was named J.V. Lawless, and in October 1921, our two grandfathers escaped together from a British internment camp in the Curragh. Heroically assisted, it has to be said, by two small boys and a donkey. The Army Museum down in the Curragh put me in touch with Frank, and I think it's incredibly cool that a book written by the grandson of one of the escapers is illustrated with a photo supplied by the grandson of the other one. Now, Frank's stationed abroad at the moment, so he couldn't be here, but I'm delighted his mother and his uncles are. Another photo in the book was given to me by Donald Casey. His uncle was a man named Charlie Daly, and without Charlie Daly we wouldn't be gathered here now, as my dad wouldn't have been born, and neither would I. In 1922 in July, just as the Civil War was starting in Donegal, Charlie Daly saved my granddad's life. Even though he was an officer in the anti-treaty IRA, and my granddad was an officer in the pro-treaty Free State Army. My granddad and his commanding officer had gone under a flag of truce to have a meeting with Charlie Daly, and because of this, in his own sense of honour, Daly prevented some of his own men from ambushing and killing my granddad and the commander as they left the meeting. And I'm convinced that my granddad still didn't know that he owed his life to Charlie Daly, when 6 months later he was a member of the court-martial that tried Daly and some other anti-treaty men after they'd been captured. And 6 weeks after that, Charlie Daly and 3 of those other men were executed as a reprisal for the killing of a Free State officer that had happened after they were captured, and for which they couldn't possibly have been responsible. They weren't tried for the killing, but they were executed for it, and they became known afterwards as the Jumbo Martyrs. The 90th anniversary of their execution was last month, and I think their story and the connection between Charlie Daly and my granddad encapsulates much of what was totally tragic and totally wrong about the Civil War. Tragic because one man owed his life to the other, and wrong because the execution could in no way be justified under the rules of war or the normal rule of law. And such executions were a policy of the first government of this state, and I don't think we should forget that. But by the same token, the fact that Donald received me into his own home, gave me the photo of his uncle, despite what had happened between our two relatives, illustrates perfectly, I think, what it's meant when people talk about leaving behind the bitter legacy of the Civil War. I do think that my granddad subsequently found out what had happened, and that in part prompted him to run off to the far side of the world with my grandma and start a new life together in Australia. And that brings me on to the reason why I chose here as the venue for this launch event. In 1928, this hotel was known as Paris Hotel, and it was Paris Hotel that my granddad gave us the address on the passenger lists for the ship on which he and my grandma went to Australia. Now, I don't know how this hotel looked in 1928, but it's quite possible my granddad set up at that bar. I would nearly describe the Australian episode of my grandparents' life as a complete and utter disaster, except that my dad was born there. However, Australia is where the plot really thickens. As a boy, my dad was always led to believe that his mother had died in childbirth, and then when he was only 2 or 3 years old, after which he and his father returned to Belfast. However, two years ago, my brother John was online and he found a copy of the passenger list for the ship on which they travelled back from Australia, and my grandma was also named on it, which meant she hadn't died out there after all. And that in turn meant there was a whole chunk of the past that had been hidden from my dad. Now, we tried everything we could to trace what had happened there when the ship came back, but we kept hitting dead ends. We knew she had originally come from County Clare, so finally in despair I wrote to the Clare Champion in the hope that one of their readers might know what had become of my grandma. And that's where Martin and Mary Cahill stopped in. Martin hasn't been well recently, so he couldn't be up here, but I'm really thrilled that Mary came up from Clare. Because Mary, in May 2011, made the most incredible phone call I've ever got in my life. Martin is a great man for reading his paper from cover to cover, and the night before he had spotted the article about my grandma. And Mary rang me the next morning, and I'll always remember the first words she said to me. She said, "My name is Mary Cahill, I'm ringing you from Clare, and I'm your father's first cousin." And Mary's mother was my grandma's sister, so Mary knew the truth about what had happened to my grandma. And without that phone call, there wouldn't have been an ending to the book. I was actually up in Belfast that day, intending to go to my granddad's grave for the first time. He could see it as significant that I was on that same day that my missing grandma reappeared out of the past where she had been hidden. But I think if you started to think too much in those lines, your head would explode. So I just think of it as an amazing coincidence. But it was thanks to that phone call 2 years ago that my dad finally got to see a photo of his mother for the very first time, 77 years after she had died. So for making that phone call, and everything that's happened since, Mary and Martin, and all the brilliant Clancy from Clare, have the undying gratitude of all the Glennon family. Now there's more to the book than just who do you think you are, or my version of it, because while researching it and writing it, I couldn't help but become aware of the bigger historical picture and some of what it had thrown up. Brian has talked on some of those points, so I won't go back over them. But I will say this, it's very much a book about the troubles in Belfast in the 1920s, and not about the more recent troubles. It's about distant history, not recent history. And I think it's important not to view what happened in the 1920s in the light of what happened in our lifetime, because that would be a totally backwards reading of history. But sometimes it's impossible not to see connections between the two. Pádraig O'Rourke is a historian who I first met while writing this book, and he's a lovely line in one of his books where he says, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it does tend to rhyme a lot." I'd like to give you one small flavour of that, which concerns a man named Haughey and the smuggling of guns into the north by the IRA, which was planned with the assistance of officers in the army down here. Now you might think I'm talking about Charlie Haughey and the arms trial of 1970. But in fact, I'm talking about his father, Johnny Haughey, who in the spring of 1922 was an officer in the Derry IRA. And my granddad was one of the army officers in Donegal who passed those guns on to Johnny Haughey. There's a great saying that goes, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And just as the Good Friday Agreement has been described as Sunningdale for slow learners, I think in some ways the recent troubles could be described as the Pogrom for slow learners. I think what happened in the years 1920 to 22 has implications for nationalism as an idea that people in the north look to today. Is there really much point in seeking unity with people who aren't that pushed about unity with you? It also poses a challenge to people in the south. Are people in the north, both Catholic and Protestant, are they Irish or are they not? Do people down here really care? Or will they cling to their own comfort zone and avoid the heartache of even thinking about the north and instead try to keep it at arm's length? Just like the new neighbour who told my mum when we moved down to Dublin in 1973 that some people on the road are not happy about refugees from Belfast moving in. Or is there a way of looking at the future in a completely different way than was done in the past? Because, to be quite honest, in the long term, I'm not sure that either Irish nationalism or British nationalism have done any lasting favours for the majority of people in either part of this island. Between the pogrom in Belfast and the civil war down here, Both of the political entities in this island were born damaged, severely damaged, and the seeds of what later happened on both sides of the border were sown. But just as importantly, many of the people who went through those events were damaged. And nowadays, we're very familiar with the term post-traumatic stress disorder. But back then, people were only getting to grips with the idea that men who had been through the trenches of the First World War could have been shell-shocked. And certainly nobody stopped to think that people who had been through the Pogrom in Belfast, through guerrilla warfare, and through a civil war could also be damaged. I think my granddad was one of the people who was damaged. The tragedy was when the Civil War ended, he was still only 22, and he had that burden of damage to carry for the rest of his life, and silence was the only way he knew how to cope with it. As I said in the book's dedication, my dad continues to inspire me. After all that I had uncovered, it would have been easy for him to look back with regret and hurt about the mother he never knew, but instead his whole focus has been on the here and now and getting to know the cousins he never even knew he had. I'm pushing 50 now, but I'm blessed that he's still giving me such valuable lessons in how to live. And by the same token, looking at the bigger picture, I think there's a value in examining the past, not to wallow in it, not to point the finger, but to simply accept what really happened without being afraid of the truth. If you know what happened, then you can learn from it and avoid making the same mistakes, and then you can start to look to the future. I'd like to think this book would play some small part in that process by ensuring that we don't forget what happened in the North from 1920 to 22, and that we don't forget what was done to Northern nationalists, both by their enemies in the North and by their so-called friends in the South. I hope you enjoy the book. Thanks very much.